War has a peculiar appetite for invention. From the sky above Normandy came not only men and munitions, but an object so small it could hide behind its rider's leg, a motorcycle that literally fell out of an aeroplane and somehow survived the landing. It was called the Welbike, the world's smallest powered vehicle to serve in combat, a design that turned Britain's thrift into engineering audacity. It had no gears, no protection, and no real dignity, but it did have purpose. In an age of colossal machines, this one proved that even a whisper could move an army. By the middle of 1941, Britain's paratroopers faced a simple but infuriating problem. They could fall from the heavens, but had to walk from there. Once a man and his kit hit the ground, everything slowed. A platoon that landed in perfect formation became a procession of men pushing bicycles through mud. The nation that had once ruled the roads had now run out of them. Airborne warfare demanded speed, and not the glamorous kind seen on posters. This was speed for survival, speed measured in the distance between cover and exposure. Commanders needed a way to move men and messages across scattered landing zones before the enemy realized what had landed in their midst. The solution, naturally, was to invent a motorcycle so small it could be packed like luggage. At the Frythe, a secret special operations executive facility camouflaged as a country estate, Major John Dolphin and his engineers faced this new demand. They were told to design a motorized means of rapid mobility for parachute insertion. In plainer English, make something with an engine that doesn't mind falling out of an aircraft. It was, by any reasonable measure, a ridiculous brief, like asking a violin to survive a house fire and still play in tune afterwards. Britain's industrial base, battered by bombing, had learned to make miracles from shortages. Metal was rationed, rubber scarce, and every machine shop was already pledged to the war effort. But Station 9's peculiar advantage was imagination unburdened by tradition. If a man could dream it, he was usually allowed to try it, provided it didn't explode in the process. The concept sketches that emerged looked like a child's toy gone rogue. 2 small wheels, a tubular frame, and a single cylinder, Villiers engine, bolted in the middle like an afterthought. The entire contraption had to fit inside a standard CLE parachute container, 43 inches long, 15 wide, 15 deep. That meant no handlebars until after landing, no fuel cap protruding, no part that couldn't fold. In short, a motorbike that didn't yet know it was one. Behind the absurdity was cold logic. A paratrooper's life expectancy during descent was short enough. His survival on the ground depended on movement. The difference between a man on foot and a man with a small engine could be measured in heartbeats. The War Office therefore approved the project, cautiously labelling it experimental transport equipment. In British bureaucracy, that phrase usually means, "We've no idea if it'll work, but do send us a memo when it breaks." The need shaped the machine's every compromise. No gears, too complex, no suspension, too heavy, no brakes worth mentioning, too optimistic. It would be simple, fast to assemble, and disposable. A device to get the soldier from landing zone to objective, not back again. Dolphin's men accepted these conditions as gospel. They saw beauty in necessity, a purity of purpose that made the whole venture strangely noble. What they built would never carry medals or headlines, yet it might carry a wounded man to safety or deliver orders through chaos. In a war of grand machines, this one would serve as a reminder that progress didn't always roar. Sometimes it merely hummed. By the winter of 1941, the requirement was clear, the resources scarce, and the humour dark. The Welbike was about to be born, and it would be the most British of inventions, equal parts brilliance, defiance, and mild disbelief that anyone had approved it in the first place. The vision of the Welbike began not with a grand speech or a military decree, but with a handful of men staring at a drawing board that looked more like a child's doodle. Major John Dolphin and his team at Station 9 were not typical officers. They were part inventor, part magician, and part lunatic, which, in wartime Britain, meant they were in exactly the right place. Station 9's mandate was simple: build things no one else would dare to. Flame-throwing jeeps, underwater torpedoes, exploding rats, all shared the same floor space as what would become the world's smallest military motorcycle. The Welbike was, in essence, a pocket solution to a continental problem. Britain needed to deliver men across enemy lines who could move quickly, quietly, and without petrol stations conveniently placed along the way. Dolphin's vision was brutally pragmatic. He imagined a single rider machine light enough to drop by parachute, yet tough enough to survive a rough landing. The engine would be supplied by Villiers, the Junior Deluxe 98 cubic centimetres, a dependable little motor used in lawnmowers and modest runabouts. If it could move a suburban postman, it could probably move a soldier with low expectations. The frame would be tubular steel, hinged at the centre so it could fold like a jackknife. Handlebars would rotate downward, foot pegs would fold inward. Every inch was measured against the inside walls of a parachute canister, which acted as both blueprint and prison. What didn't fit simply didn't exist. There was no aesthetic indulgence here, only geometry and endurance. The military, predictably, hesitated. The parachute regiment preferred to leap with rifles, not with motorbikes clutched to their knees. But Dolphin persisted, armed with logic rather than rank. The Welbike, he argued, wasn't luxury. It was survival. A man who can move, he told his superiors, is a man who can return. That single line bought him another month of funding and a cautious nod from Whitehall. Of course, the same committee also approved a plan for inflatable tanks, which tells you everything about wartime optimism. The prototype emerged in mid-1942, little more than a skeleton on wheels. It had no suspension, no lights, and a fuel tank that held enough petrol to reach the nearest disappointment. Yet, when the engineers wheeled it onto the test ground and kicked it into life, something unexpected happened. It worked. The little engine stuttered, coughed, then settled into a rhythm best described as apologetic but determined. It was alive. At that moment, Dolphin saw more than a gadget. He saw a philosophy, that wartime engineering was not about adding, but removing. Every ounce, every hinge, every curve had a reason. The Welbike became a symbol of minimalist invention under maximum pressure. The irony was delicious. In the age of Spitfires and Shermans, Britain's most daring idea was smaller than a tea tray. The ministry soon ordered trials. Reports from Station 9 described a portable, one-man machine of satisfactory endurance and minimal signature. In other words, it moved and didn't explode. That was progress enough. Plans were drawn for limited production under Excelsior Motor Company in Coventry. Britain had managed to design a motorcycle that could be dropped from the sky and, with any luck, wouldn't immediately die upon impact, which, by 1942 standards, qualified as genius. With the vision now tangible, the engineers of Coventry prepared to transform it from prototype into practice, a leap from the drawing board into the turbulence of war. If the vision had been daring, the build was downright heroic. At the Excelsior Motor Company in Coventry, the Welbike entered production under the kind of conditions that would make modern safety inspectors faint. Half the workforce had been drafted, half the lights had been bombed out, and half the machinery had been rebuilt from scrap. Yet somehow they produced motorcycles. The instructions from Station 9 were simple: make it fit, make it run, and make it quick. Excelsior's engineers stared at the blueprints and wondered if someone had spilled tea on them. The frame was scarcely 3 feet high, the engine barely a palm's width across. It looked less like a vehicle and more like something you'd use to churn butter in an emergency. Still, British industry had never been accused of lacking optimism. Metal stock was cut, tubes bent, and the first frames welded in workshops that still smelled faintly of cordite. The welders, most of them women by now, developed the finesse of surgeons. Each joint had to be perfect. There was no spare weight for excess metal. Every ounce mattered, and every ounce was accounted for in triplicate. The Villiers engines arrived by train, crated and tagged Junior Deluxe. They were tested on benches that vibrated so violently the clock on the wall gained minutes. Mechanics listened for misfires with stethoscopes because the engines were too small for proper diagnostics. If it coughed like a gentleman clearing his throat, it passed inspection. If it sneezed, it failed. Assembly was a ballet of compression and compromise. Fuel tanks were brazed under low light. The folding hinges were hand-ground until they moved like the lid of a piano. Every sub-assembly had to fold into a perfect rectangle. The engineers joked that if anyone sneezed too hard, the entire machine would fold itself out of existence. Even packaging became part of the engineering. Each Welbike had to slide neatly into a CLE parachute canister, which meant the handlebars folded, the seat dropped, and the pedals tucked away. It was the origami of warfare, a motorcycle that could play dead until called upon. When the first prototypes were ready, testing took place on the rough tracks around the factory. Mechanics rode them through puddles, potholes, and the occasional misplaced livestock. They found that the little machine could reach 30 miles per hour on level ground, provided the rider had no fear, no shame, and a very forgiving spine. Production scaled up through 1942. Hundreds rolled off Excelsior's improvised lines, painted a dull olive green that seemed to absorb the factory's fatigue. Quality control meant 2 engineers arguing over whether a rattle was normal vibration or imminent failure. The answer usually was yes. But despite the chaos, each Welbike that left Coventry bore the mark of purpose. Its very existence was proof that ingenuity could thrive under siege. A tiny engine, a handful of bolts, and a design so implausible it might have been British understatement in metal form. When the ministry received the first completed batch, an inspector noted they were suitable for operational evaluation. Translated from bureaucratese, that meant, we haven't the faintest idea if they'll work, but they're too interesting not to try. So the Welbike left the factory, a triumph of necessity over sense, bound for the airfields where gravity would be its first real critic. Testing a motorcycle that drops from the sky sounds like the setup for a joke, and in 1942 it very nearly was. The Welbike's trials began at RAF Ringway, where Britain trained its paratroopers and occasionally tested gravity's patience. Rows of canisters were loaded into aircraft, each containing a neatly folded motorcycle, and the hopes of several engineers who really should have known better. The order came. Release! Parachutes opened, silk snapped, and dozens of canisters drifted earthward, each one a small promise wrapped in aluminium. Then came the landings. Some touched down perfectly, others didn't. A few were reduced to what one observer described as a sort of metallic custard. It turns out, while the Welbike could survive the war, it wasn't entirely sure about surviving the trip to it. Still, the trials continued. Engineers adjusted padding inside the canister, reinforced the hinge bolts, and rerouted fuel lines that tended to disconnect upon impact. Every test revealed something new to fix, and every fix revealed something else to break. It was iterative design in its purest form, or, as one mechanic put it, trial and occasionally quite a lot of error. Once the bikes landed intact, they were unfolded, fueled, and started on sight. The routine became almost theatrical. Twist the bars upright, drop the seat, flick the choke, and kick. When it worked, the little Villiers engine sputtered to life with a sound like a bee trying to remember a tune. When it didn't, the operator walked. In the Army's hierarchy of reliability, the Welbike was somewhere between a bicycle and a prayer. Performance testing followed. On hard ground, the machine could reach 25 to 30 miles per hour, impressive for something lighter than the average Labrador. In mud or sand, it sank with all the enthusiasm of a submarine. Riders soon learned to keep moving. Once stopped, the Welbike required both hands and most of one's vocabulary to free again. At Ringway and later Salisbury Plain, instructors used them for courier runs between landing points. Soldiers laughed, then raced them, then grudgingly respected them. A man on a Welbike could outpace a runner by a wide margin, provided the engine held out longer than his patience. Reports from the field came back dry and understated. Machine operates satisfactorily under controlled conditions, one noted. Translation: it worked once on tarmac during summer. Yet even skeptics admitted that the concept was sound. It turned paratroopers into couriers, messengers, and scouts in minutes. One officer observed that the Welbike was a motorized advantage of questionable dignity, which, given the sight of a full-grown man crouched on something smaller than his rucksack, was perhaps fair. By late 1942, the design was deemed serviceable for operational trials. Excelsior's engineers returned to Coventry with modest pride. They had built a flying motorcycle that almost lived up to its myth. In war, almost was often enough. The final report summarized the machine with typical understatement. The Welbike fulfills its purpose within limits dictated by its size. That sentence could have described most of Britain's wartime effort. Practical genius powered by just enough optimism to keep the wheels turning. The Welbike had proven it could fall, land, and run. 3 achievements that, under the circumstances, qualified as a miracle. The next challenge would be to see whether it could also survive war itself. By 1943, the Welbike had earned its wings, quite literally. After endless tinkering and testing, the first production units were loaded into canisters bound for airborne divisions. It was issued to the 1st and 6th Airborne, and a handful of special operations groups who believed any problem could be solved with a parachute and good manners. The official line described it as personal transport for use by parachute and glider troops. The unofficial line was, it's a motorbike that might actually work, provided you apologize to it first. The breakthrough came not in technology, but in trust. Paratroopers, famously hard to impress, began to realize that a man on a Welbike could cover the distance between drop zone and rendezvous point in minutes, rather than quarter hours. It wasn't fast by peacetime standards, but in war, speed is measured against the time it takes for someone to shoot at you. Exercises across Britain proved the concept. Men dropped, landed, unfolded the machine in under 10 seconds, and rode off. The first few miles were exhilarating. The next few were exhausting. With a wheelbase shorter than a broom and tyres thinner than a sandwich, comfort was theoretical. But it moved, and movement meant life. The Welbike's first operational outings came with airborne units training for North Africa and later Sicily. It performed admirably on firm ground and abysmally on sand. Engines choked, wheels dug in, and riders discovered that lightweight had its drawbacks when gravity fought back. Still, reports were encouraging enough to push production past the 1,000 mark. Then came Arnhem, 1944. The Dutch landscape, with its tight streets and open fields, was both perfect and perilous. British paratroopers rode Welbikes from landing sites to bridges under fire, using them for message runs and casualty transport. Some made it, others didn't. The machine was never designed for glory, but it became part of one of the war's most tragic victories of spirit. In after-action reports, commanders praised its ingenuity, but noted limitations under adverse ground conditions, which is military code for it stopped moving the moment the ground remembered it was made of mud. Yet even that faint success mattered. For the first time, a paratrooper had his own motorized independence, something faster than a March, quieter than a Jeep, and smaller than hope itself. The Welbike wasn't a breakthrough of performance, it was a breakthrough of possibility. It showed that mobility didn't need to weigh a ton or drink a gallon to matter. Of course, the romance faded as soon as the war moved north. Snow and cold exposed every weakness, the lack of a kick-start spring, the feeble tyres, and the absence of suspension. Men rode them until they broke, then carried them like luggage, muttering oaths fit to blister paint. One veteran described it as a fine machine, provided your destination is downhill. But even its failures had value. Each broken hinge, each seized piston, fed into the next generation of airborne transport ideas. Collapsible jeeps, folding bicycles, even the Corgi scooter of peacetime. The Welbike had done what it was born to do, prove that the improbable could be practical, at least for long enough to make history blink. By war's end, the Welbike was both a success and a relic, a rare machine whose triumph lay not in conquest, but in creativity. It never won battles, but it moved men who did. And for a motorbike that fell out of the sky, that was rather a good day's work. The war ended, but the Welbike story didn't. Once the guns fell silent, Britain found itself with warehouses full of surplus equipment, rifles, helmets, trucks, and a few thousand tiny motorcycles that no one was quite sure what to do with. In typical British fashion, the solution was simple: sell them to anyone daft enough to want one. They appeared in auction catalogues with the majestic title Light Military Motorcycle Folding. Farmers bought them for errands, engineers for curiosity, and schoolboys for trouble. Within a year, the Welbike had transitioned from classified project to garden shed challenge. Because if there's one thing the British can't resist, it's fixing something that wasn't really broken until they started fixing it. The Ministry of Supply, ever pragmatic, saw no harm in this. A war machine that couldn't fire bullets was harmless enough. But in garages across the country, something remarkable began: the reinvention of the Welbike for peace. Its simplicity made it the perfect platform for tinkering. Mechanics added mudguards, fuel tanks, and even headlights, luxuries its original riders could only dream of. It wasn't long before someone asked the obvious question: if it can fall from the sky, why not ride it to work? Enter the Corgi, a civilianized Welbike reborn in colour. Built by Brockhouse Engineering and fitted with the same Villiers 98 cubic centimetre engine, it became the postman's steed, the messenger's mule, and occasionally the commuter's nightmare. Painted in cheerful blues and reds, it was the Welbike without the war. Essentially the same idea, just now delivered without the risk of small arms fire. The economic consequence was quietly profound. In the austerity years, mobility meant opportunity. Small manufacturers, inspired by the Welbike's ingenuity, began producing scooters, mopeds, and folding bicycles. The design language of compact efficiency, born from wartime scarcity, became the aesthetic of peacetime recovery. A culture of make-do engineering turned into a market for affordable freedom. Meanwhile, the philosophy behind the Welbike infiltrated the military world in subtler ways. Compactness and modularity became the new virtues. Future airborne vehicles borrowed its logic, from lightweight jeeps to collapsible motorbikes for commandos. The machine had taught an army that mobility was not measured in horsepower, but in how quickly one could disappear. There was also a moral undertone. The Welbike embodied a kind of humility in engineering, invention without aggression. It carried no weapon, demanded no armour, and asked nothing more than a flat patch of ground. In a century defined by destruction, it represented creation at its most modest. It was the mechanical equivalent of the British stiff upper lip, slightly ridiculous, faintly heroic, and somehow still running after all this time. By the 1950s, the original Welbikes had become collectors' curiosities, their military paint replaced by domestic gloss. Yet their impact lingered in every corner of British industry. Proof that efficiency, once learned, never quite unlearns itself. The little machine had shown that scarcity breeds brilliance, and that small ideas can leave large shadows. Its hidden consequence was not the vehicle itself, but the mindset it left behind, one of quiet invention, unglamorous precision, and the unshakable belief that there's always room for improvement, even if that room happens to be a steel canister hurtling toward the ground. The Welbike's active service ended quietly, without ceremony, medals, or farewell parades. It simply slipped out of the Army's vocabulary, replaced by newer, larger ideas. But what remained was a cult, a small, determined brotherhood of engineers, collectors, and historians who refused to let Britain's most improbable motorcycle vanish into obscurity. Today, surviving Welbikes are scattered across museums from Duxford to Johannesburg. Their tiny frames sit beside tanks and artillery pieces that once dwarfed them in battle. Visitors walk past the giants, stop, and then lean in to peer at this strange mechanical toy. Some smile, others blink in disbelief. It's the only war machine in history that makes people ask, "Are you sure this isn't a joke?" Collectors treasure the few hundred that survived. Many are rusted, folded, and dented, yet all tell the same improbable story, that Britain once built a motorcycle so small it had to parachute into the fight. Restorers labour over them with reverence, sourcing Villiers engines from sheds, machining impossible parts, and painting them in hues that range from regulation drab to quietly rebellious gloss. A restored Welbike commands admiration not for its speed or power, but for the audacity of its purpose. Its influence travelled further than expected. The post-war scooter boom drew directly from its design logic: light, foldable, cheap to build. From the Corgi to the Vespa, echoes of the Welbike's compact engineering appeared in every European city still digging itself out of rubble. Even the idea of personal transport, once a civilian luxury, became a universal right, seeded by the notion that freedom could be measured in miles per pint. Museums tell the tale with gentle irony. The labels describe it as a folding airborne motorcycle, though none mention the bruised paratroopers who learned that folding it was easier than riding it. Veterans who rode them, when asked, often laugh before they speak. Their stories are identical: land, unpack, ride a few yards, and then push the rest of the way. Yet each one adds, with a smile, "Still better than walking." It's a curious legacy, a machine both loved and laughed at, a contradiction only the British could mass produce. The Welbike also shaped Britain's post-war identity as a nation of inventive pragmatists. Its DNA ran through every garden shed miracle that followed: the hovercraft, the Mini, the Sinclair bicycle. The lesson was simple but enduring. Good design isn't always grand, and greatness can be made in a teacup. The Welbike proved that you didn't need resources, or even sense, just purpose and a bit of brass. At the Traylor Technology Centre, one example remains perfectly restored. Beneath the lights, its metal gleams softly, a relic that once carried men across battlefields. It sits lower than the ropes that guard it, as if still crouched in humility. Visitors glance down, some chuckling, others quietly impressed. The plaque reads, "Welbike, Airborne Motorcycle, 1942. Nothing about it moves anymore, but in that stillness lies the paradox of progress. From its limited purpose came unlimited influence. From its simplicity came generations of complexity. And from its absurdity came proof that imagination, once airborne, rarely lands where expected. In the end, the Welbike didn't just survive history, it outlived its own punchline. In the long silence after the war, Britain looked back at its inventions, the way an exhausted soldier looks at his kit, half in pride, half in disbelief that any of it worked at all. Among the relics of that restless ingenuity stood the Welbike, a contraption so unlikely it seemed to belong more to folklore than fact. It had begun as a solution to a logistical nightmare, how to move a man across enemy terrain with nothing but air, hope, and a parachute for company. By the time peace returned, it had become a parable of its own, proof that when the world falls apart, the smallest ideas often keep it stitched together. Every curve of its frame, every compromise in its design, spoke to the wartime condition: make do, move fast, stay alive. There was no ornament, no waste, no vanity, just metal bent to a purpose, then folded neatly away. It was engineering distilled to its most British essence, over-complicated simplicity. Standing before one now, decades later, it feels like looking at the physical embodiment of understatement. Its tank holds less fuel than a teapot, its engine barely powerful enough to argue with a hill. And yet, it carried men through fire and fear with more resolve than many machines 10 times its size. That is the paradox of the Welbike. Frail in form, fierce in spirit. Its creators never set out to build a legend. They wanted a tool. But history has a habit of elevating what was never meant to last. The Welbike was disposable, functional, and modest, and precisely because of that, it survived. Like so many of Britain's wartime inventions, it existed not to dominate, but to endure. In an age obsessed with horsepower, it quietly reminded the world that courage weighs less than steel. Modern eyes see it and smile. It looks quaint, even comical, perched on its tiny tires, as if waiting for a child who never came back from play. But if one listens closely to the soft hum of its Villiers engine, the click of its folding hinges, there's a kind of dignity there, a whisper of utility, born from desperation, preserved by memory. When paratroopers rode it, they were not seeking glamour, they were chasing time. Every mile on that small machine bought moments of advantage, the most precious currency in war. The Welbike wasn't designed for victory parades. It was built for the first 5 minutes after landing, when everything mattered and nothing worked as planned. It wasn't a machine of glory, but of grace under impossible circumstances. And that's a rarer thing altogether. In the broader chronicle of mechanized warfare, it holds a small paragraph, but one written in bold, not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it reflected the spirit that did: resolve without resources, humour without hope, and invention without ego. Today the Welbike lives on as a symbol of human proportion in an age of mechanical excess, a reminder that great design isn't always loud, and that sometimes the quietest machines speak most clearly about who we were. So the next time you see one, crouched behind a rope in a museum, don't laugh, listen. The little engine may have stopped, but the idea hasn't, because in every age that forgets its limits, there's still a need for something small, clever, and slightly mad to remind us what invention really means.